Mrs. Ellis hadn't always been the curious type. She used to keep to herself, especially since her husband passed away 5 years ago. But something about that dog struck a chord deep inside her. Maybe it was the way he sat all upright, proud, never begging, never barking for attention. There was a sense of dignity in him, something rare even in people these days. She began watching him more closely. Every hour, every movement. She noticed how he never left the house's boundary, as if an invisible leash tied him to that doorstep. Once or twice, someone walking their own dog tried to approach, but he would simply rise and stand tall, giving a low growl, not out of aggression, but out of warning. He wasn't interested in friends. He was on duty. A few days later, Mrs. Ellis noticed something that shook her even more. While watering her front yard flowers in the early evening, she saw the dog approach the door and gently paw at it. Not scratch, just a soft, careful pawing, like he expected someone to open it from the inside. Then he sat back down, eyes locked on the wood, and didn't move for hours. It was too much. That night, Mrs. Ellis stayed up late searching online. She looked up the address, searched for property records, anything that could tell her who used to live there. After some digging, she found a name, Walter Harris. There was a phone number on an old online listing, long disconnected. She searched local hospital databases and war veteran records. It was slow work for someone not very tech-savvy, but determination carried her. She also called the local animal control office and asked if they had ever picked up a German Shepherd from Oak Ridge Lane. They hadn't. The next morning, she called the town hall and asked if anyone by the name Walter Harris had recently passed or moved away. After being transferred 3 times, a kind clerk confirmed something unsettling. Walter Harris had been taken to the hospital nearly 3 years ago, and no one ever heard from him again. Mrs. Ellis felt a strange weight press on her chest. She looked out her window again. The shepherd was still there. Later that day, she crossed the street for the first time with slow, careful steps. She didn't want to scare him. In her hand was a warm blanket and a small bowl of cooked rice and chicken. The dog stood as she approached, ears alert. He didn't growl, but he didn't come closer either. She set the bowl down a few feet from the porch and laid the blanket gently at the edge of the stairs. "I know you don't trust me," she whispered, "but I'm going to help you." He didn't blink. His gaze was focused behind her, still watching that front door. She stepped back and crossed the street again, from her window. She watched the shepherd waited nearly 30 minutes before approaching the food. He sniffed, then ate slowly, carefully. When he finished, he sniffed the blanket, then walked back to his usual spot near the front door, curled into a ball, and fell asleep. Mrs. Ellis cried. It was the first time in years. She had wept not out of grief or loneliness, but out of compassion, for a soul more loyal than most humans she'd ever known. That night, she made a promise. She would uncover the truth, not just about the man who used to live there, but about this extraordinary dog who refused to move on. She picked up her phone and dialed the hospital listed in the clerk's record. "Hi, I'm looking for information on a patient named Walter Harris," she said. "He was brought in about 3 years ago." The nurse on the other end paused, double quotes. "Yes, I remember him," she finally said. "He came in alone, no ID, no one claimed him. I'm sorry to say, he passed a few days after arriving." Mrs. Ellis's hand trembled. "He had a dog," she whispered. "A shepherd. He's still waiting outside that house. He never left." The line went quiet for a moment. "I'll never forget him," the nurse said softly. "He kept asking if Max was okay." That must be the dog's name. Max. Mrs. Ellis's heart cracked open. So he had a name. Max. The soldier had a name, and now, his story was just beginning. Mrs. Ellis couldn't stop thinking about that phone call. Max. The name echoed in her mind all night. It gave the silent figure across the street a new kind of identity, something personal, something painfully real. No longer was he just the dog on the porch. He was Max, a dog who had waited 3 years for an owner who would never return. Next morning, she opened her curtains early. The sun had barely risen, but Max was already awake. As usual, he stood facing the door, tail still, ears perked. "Waiting," she whispered through the glass. "Good morning, Max." That day, she walked over again. She didn't bring food this time, only herself. She stopped at the edge of the path and sat on the sidewalk, folding her hands on her lap. Max glanced at her briefly, then returned his gaze to the door. For 20 minutes, neither of them moved. When she stood up to leave, she said gently. I'll see you tomorrow. In the days that followed, their quiet routine continued. Max never approached her, but he no longer saw her as a stranger. He allowed her presence, and in a strange way, it felt like they were building something, an understanding that didn't need words. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ellis dug deeper into the past. She asked her neighbor, Daniel, a university student home for the summer, to help her search online records. Together, they found a few local articles about Mr. Walter Harris, a retired war veteran who had moved into the house nearly a decade ago. The articles mentioned he had served in 2 tours overseas and had rescued a young dog from a flood in his final year of service. Must have been Max, Daniel said, scrolling through faded photographs. They even found an old photo from a community event. In it, Mr. Harris stood tall in uniform, with a small shepherd pup by his side. The caption read, "Veteran Walter Harris and his companion Max, a symbol of loyalty and healing." Mrs. Ellis felt the sting of tears. So Max hadn't just been a pet. He had been Mr. Harris's lifeline, his family, and now, with his owner gone, he was holding on to the only duty he had left, watching the door. Word of the story began to spread through the neighborhood. People started to slow down more often in front of the house. A few left bones or treats near the gate. A couple of children drew pictures of Max and taped them to the fence. One child even made a cardboard sign that read, "He's a good boy. Please don't scare him." But Max remained focused, undistracted. Daniel, curious about Max's loyalty, set up a small camera across the street. He wanted to see what Max did during the night. The footage shocked them all. Between 2 and 3 a.m. Max would rise, walk to the front door, and sit silently for exactly 17 minutes. Every single night. Same time, same place, same motionless vigil. Then he would return to the side of the porch, curl up, and sleep. It's like he still thinks he'll hear the door open. Daniel whispered one evening, watching the playback. Mrs. Ellis said nothing. She couldn't. Her heart was too full. One day, she decided to place something on the porch, an old photo frame. Inside was a printed copy of the picture they found of Mr. Harris and Max, side by side. She placed it beside the door, gently, as Max watched her closely. "This was your person," she said. "I thought you might want to remember." To her surprise, Max didn't walk away from the frame. He sniffed it. Then, slowly, he lay down right beside it and rested his head. Mrs. Ellis covered her mouth with her hand. That night, as she returned to her own home, she looked back one last time. Max was still lying by the photo, as if guarding not just the house but a memory. The whispers had stopped. The wonder had deepened. Max wasn't just a dog on a porch. He was a story waiting to be told, and Mrs. Ellis had just begun to tell it. Daniel returned the next day with a folder full of notes and printouts. "I found something you might want to see," he said, placing the folder on Mrs. Ellis's kitchen table. Inside were old newspaper clippings, archived obituaries, and service records. It was a quiet treasure trove of details about Walter Harris, details that had been buried under the dust of time. He was awarded a Medal of Valor during his second deployment, Daniel explained. But what really caught my attention was this. He pulled out a page from a veteran newsletter. The headline read, "Wounded Vet Reunites with Dog He Rescued from Overseas Flood." There, in grainy black and white, was the image of Harris, kneeling beside a soaked German Shepherd puppy. The article told the story of how Harris had pulled the dog, then just a few months old, from a collapsed shelter in a war-torn village during a flash flood. The pup had been clinging to debris, nearly swept away. They said he insisted on bringing Max back to the States. Daniel added, "He filled out every form, jumped through every hoop." Mrs. Ellis ran her fingers over the photo. Her throat tightened. So this wasn't just a pet. Max was more than a companion. He was a miracle. Over. As the story continued to unfold, Mrs. Ellis began to visit the porch more frequently. Max had started to accept her presence. He still wouldn't come inside the gate, but he no longer flinched when she moved closer. One afternoon, she sat on the top step and pulled out a small journal. "I thought maybe you'd want to hear about him," she said to Max. "Since you can't read the papers." The dog tilted his head. She opened the journal and began reading aloud the stories they had uncovered about Mr. Harris, his bravery, his quiet humility, his struggle with PTSD when he came home, and most of all, his love for Max. "There's a line in this article," she said softly. "He calls Max his anchor. Says the dog saved him just as much as he saved the dog." Max blinked slowly, eyes gentle. It felt as though some invisible bridge was forming between them. Each day, she gave Max a little more of his own story back, and in return, Max gave her something she didn't know she'd lost it. Purpose. But something still didn't make sense. Why didn't anyone come for Max after Mr. Harris passed away? She asked Daniel one evening. They both sat in her living room, files and papers spread across the coffee table. Daniel tapped his finger on a hospital report. Mr. Harris came in unconscious. No ID, no contacts. And it looks like he wasn't admitted under his full name, just as Walter H. He passed away within a few days. No one even knew he had a dog. Mrs. Ellis felt her stomach sink. So Max waited. And no one even told him. The weight of it was unbearable. For 3 years, Max had guarded a house, not knowing his person had died in a hospital just a few miles away. His world had ended quietly, without a goodbye. Mrs. Ellis couldn't shake the thought. She knew now she couldn't let Max spend another year on that porch, waiting for someone who would never return. She picked up the phone and called the local Veterans Affairs office. "I'm looking for any living relatives of Walter Harris," she said. "He passed 3 years ago, and there's a dog involved. A very loyal dog." The woman on the other end promised to look into it. In the meantime, Mrs. Ellis kept reading to Max every day. She printed out more photos and taped them beside the porch. She even played a recording of Harris's voice an interview from a veterans podcast, hoping Max might recognize it. The moment she pressed play, Max's ears perked. He stood up, walked to the door, and let out a soft, heart-wrenching whine. Mrs. Ellis bit her lip. He remembered, even after all this time, that night, the porch light flickered slightly, and Mrs. Ellis noticed something new. Max had moved his sleeping spot. Instead of the far edge, he now lay right in front of the door, head resting beneath the doorknob, as if he was closer than ever to finally going home. A week passed before the veterans office called back. Mrs. Ellis stood in her kitchen, the phone pressed tightly to her ear as she listened to the calm, apologetic voice on the other end. "We did a full search," the woman explained. "Walter Harris had no next of kin listed, no surviving family. According to our records, he was buried at Greenfield Memorial under a simple government marker. No service. No one claimed the body." Mrs. Ellis closed her eyes, and no one knew about Max. She asked quietly. There was a pause. No. His property was sealed shortly after. The house was scheduled for public sale, but was delayed due to some paperwork backlog. She thanked the woman and hung up, then stood at the window, watching Max curled up under the fading sunlight. The dog had grown thinner, his once shiny coat now dulled with dust. He still kept his eyes on the front door, but there was a weariness in his body that hadn't been there before. The truth was cruel. Max had stayed behind with no one to tell him the war was over, that his duty had ended. He had waited for 3 years because no one thought to look back. Mrs. Ellis felt something stir inside her, a quiet fury. This dog had given his loyalty, his entire soul, and had been forgotten like a misplaced key. She couldn't let that be the end. The next day, she and Daniel drove out to Greenfield Memorial. It was a quiet cemetery on the edge of town, rows of identical white stones lining the green hill. They found it after 20 minutes of searching. Walter H. Harris, U.S. Army veteran, faithful until the end. Daniel removed his cap and stepped back. Mrs. Ellis stood in front of the grave, heart aching. "He died alone," she whispered, "and Max has been holding vigil for a ghost." She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the marker. Then, after a moment's thought, she took a photo of the grave with her phone. "Max deserves to see this," she said softly. That evening, back at home, she sat across the street from the house once more. Max, as always, was lying by the door, his eyes blinking slowly in the golden light. She knelt by the gate and held up the phone. The photo of the grave displayed on the screen. "I found him, Max," she said gently. "He didn't leave you on purpose. He's not coming back. But he didn't forget you." Max didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he stood up and walked down the steps. For the first time in 3 years, he walked to the gate where she stood. She held her breath. He stared at the photo, then looked at her. There was something new in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or understanding. "Perhaps both," she whispered. "You did your job. You were faithful, just like he said." Max let out a low whine, then pressed his head against the gate. It was the first time he had ever touched Her. Mrs. Ellis reached through the bars and rested her hand on his fur. It was coarse, matted in places, but warm. Tears welled up in her eyes. The next morning, she called the local paper and told them everything. Max's wait, Mr. Harris's quiet passing, the forgotten story of loyalty that had gone unnoticed by the world. The paper published a feature called The Dog Who Waited. Within days, the story spread. The community rallied. People came by, with flowers, dog treats, and handwritten letters. A group of veterans visited the house to salute Max. Someone even set up a small donation box to help with his care. Max remained on the porch, but now he wasn't alone. Mrs. Ellis made it her mission to honor both man and dog. She visited the cemetery every week, always taking something from Max, a worn toy, a piece of his blanket, even a paw print once made in soft clay. And every time she returned, Max would greet her at the gate. Something in him had shifted. Still watched the door, but now he allowed people near. He began eating more, resting easier, and every now and then he would wag his tail just slightly, as if remembering a man who had saved him once, and a woman who had finally told the world his story. The storm arrived without much warning. Thick clouds gathered over Oak Ridge Lane, casting long shadows across the neighborhood as the wind howled through the trees. People rushed to bring in laundry, shut windows, and secure loose porch furniture. Rain hammered the streets within minutes, but Max didn't move from his post. He sat under the overhang of the porch, water dripping from the corners of the roof, wind blowing leaves across the yard. He curled into himself but kept his head up, still facing the door, still waiting. Mrs. Ellis watched from her window, heart pounding. The rain was relentless. Lightning cracked the sky, and thunder shook the ground. She saw Max shiver, his body trembling from the cold. Enough was enough. She grabbed her coat, pulled on her boots, and crossed the street with an umbrella in one hand and a thick wool blanket in the other. Rain soaked her shoulders, but she didn't care. Max, she called out as she reached the gate. Please, sweetheart, you don't have to do this anymore. Max lifted his head but didn't move. She opened the gate slowly. This was the first time she had dared to enter the yard. Her heart beat wildly in her chest as her boots sank slightly into the muddy path. It's okay, she whispered. I'm not here to take you away. I just want to keep you warm. Max looked at her for a long moment, then lowered his head. Again she walked up the porch steps and gently laid the blanket across his back. For the first time, he didn't pull away. He let her cover him, tucking the ends gently under his paws. His body was ice cold. Mrs. Ellis sat beside him, her back against the front door. She placed the umbrella between them, more symbolic than useful now. I know you're still waiting, she said softly, stroking his soaked fur. But it's been 3 years, Max. He's not coming back. She looked out at the storm. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving either. Thunder rolled again, but Max didn't flinch. His body trembled less now. He seemed to relax slightly, his eyes slowly closing. For the first time, he was allowing someone to stay close during a storm. Mrs. Ellis sat with him until the rain began to slow. Her hands numb, her coat heavy with water, but her spirit strangely light. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, Max had let her in at least a little. The next morning, she noticed something troubling. Max was limping again, worse than before. He struggled to stand. His breath was shallow, and he didn't touch the food she left. Worried, she called Dr. Lindholm, the town's kind-hearted veterinarian, and explained everything. I'll come to him, he said, without hesitation. Sounds like he wouldn't do well in a clinic anyway. That afternoon, Dr. Lindholm arrived with a medical bag, approaching slowly and calmly. Max stayed on the porch, too tired to react. Mrs. Ellis watched nervously as the vet examined him. He's old, the vet said gently, and this kind of loyalty, it takes a toll. His joints are stiff, his heart rate is low, and he's showing signs of kidney strain. He's been out here too long. Mrs. Ellis swallowed hard. Can he recover? The vet paused. We can make him comfortable. He needs rest, warmth, maybe a chance to feel safe again. But no, he's not the young soldier he used to be. Tears stung her eyes. She looked at Max, still lying by the door, still facing inward. He won't come inside, she whispered, not even for food. Dr. Lindholm looked at her. Then maybe the house should come to him. That night, Mrs. Ellis brought out a heater and placed it just inside the open doorway. Facing Max, she laid a thick, clean bed on the porch and set a lantern beside it. She even hung the photo of Mr. Harris and Max right above the door. She sat with him again, wrapping him in the blanket. "You kept your promise," she said quietly. "You stayed. You waited. But now it's okay to rest." He would want that. Max didn't move, but his breathing slowed. His eyes, once so sharp, now blinked in soft acceptance. And for the first time, he leaned his head gently against her knee. The storm had passed, but the deeper storm inside Max was finally beginning. Too quiet. The days that followed the storm were quieter. The clouds had cleared, but a new kind of heaviness settled over Oak Ridge Lane. Max didn't rise at sunrise anymore. He no longer performed his old rituals, checking the door, circling the porch, lifting his ears at passing cars. Instead, he slept longer, moved slower, and ate less. Mrs. Ellis watched him with a growing ache in her heart. She still crossed the street each morning and sat beside him, reading softly from the journal she had created. She filled it with old stories, memories she'd collected from neighbors who had known Mr. Harris in passing, how he used to walk Max every evening at precisely 6 p.m., how he'd wave silently at everyone, always wearing his old army jacket. Max listened with half-closed eyes, his head resting on the blanket Mrs. Ellis had washed and brought from home. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by with a small surprise. "I made this for Max," he said, holding out a hand-carved wooden plaque. It was simple but beautiful. Etched into the wood were the words, "Max, guardian of the door, faithful." Until the end, Mrs. Ellis ran her hand over the lettering. Speechless. They gently nailed it to the front porch wall beside the old photograph of Max and Mr. Harris. It was a quiet ceremony, just the three of them, but something about it felt right, like a farewell whispered into the wind. That night, Max didn't sleep on the edge of the porch. He slowly rose, stretched with great effort, and walked to the front door. With a sigh, he curled up directly beneath the photo and the plaque. Mrs. Ellis took a deep breath. "He knows," she said. "He's saying goodbye." The following morning brought the unexpected. Mrs. Ellis walked over as usual, but Max wasn't. Outside, panic gripped her chest. She called softly, then louder, but there was no sound. Then she saw him, just inside the open doorway. He had stepped inside, for the first time in 3 years. She moved slowly, heart pounding. Max was lying just a few feet into the house, curled beside the dusty armchair where Mr. Harris once sat every night. Mrs. Ellis knelt beside him, tears already streaming down her cheeks. "Oh, Max," she whispered, "you came home." The house still smelled of time. The air was stale, and the furniture covered in a fine layer of dust, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that Max had crossed the threshold. It was his decision. He had waited, endured, guarded. But now, his heart knew it was time. Dr. Lindholm visited again that afternoon. After checking Max's vitals, he sat beside Mrs. Ellis. "In the living room, he's peaceful," the vet said. "This is the most at rest I've seen him." Mrs. Ellis nodded, wiping her face. "Will he?" Dr. Lindholm placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Soon. His body is slowing, but he's comfortable, and he's not afraid." That evening, Mrs. Ellis stayed in the house for the first time. She brought her rocking chair from home, a small lamp, and a cup of tea. She placed the lamp near the armchair and read aloud until the light began to fade. Max didn't move, but once, as she turned a page, she felt his paw stretch out and touch her foot. She placed her hand over his and smiled through her tears. "You waited so long," she whispered, "but now, it's okay to rest. He would be so proud of you." Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. A few lights flickered on across the street. The wind rustled the trees softly. And inside, a loyal heart once so full of duty and hope began to slow with peace. Max had found his way home, not because someone called him, but because he finally knew, in his own heart, that his mission was complete. Morning light spilled through the dusty windows of the Harris home, golden and still. The silence inside was heavier than usual, but not sad, just still. Like the air was holding its breath. Mrs. Ellis sat quietly in the old rocking chair she had brought over, her hand resting gently on Max's side. He hadn't stirred since the night before. His breathing was slow, steady, but barely there. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, her own heart aching with every breath he took. "You're so brave," she whispered, "so strong, but you don't have to be anymore." Outside, the sun crept across the yard, lighting up the plaque beside the front door. "Max, guardian of the door, faithful." until the end. Neighbors had begun to notice Max's absence from the porch. A few people slowed their cars. Children on bikes glanced toward the empty steps. Even the birds seemed quieter. Inside. Time passed gently. Mrs. Ellis stayed with him all day. She sang softly, read from the old journal, and told him stories from her own life, how she met her husband, what their favorite meal had been, the way their dog used to bark every time the doorbell rang. And Max, though unmoving, listened. His ears still gave the tiniest twitch at the sound of her voice. Later in the afternoon, Daniel arrived with a warm meal and some flowers. He stepped inside quietly and froze when he saw Max. His voice caught in his throat. "Is it time?" he asked. Mrs. Ellis didn't answer at first. She simply looked at Max and then nodded slowly. Daniel knelt by the dog's side, gently placing the flowers beside the armchair. "You're a legend, buddy," he said softly. "Everyone knows now. Everyone's talking about you." Max gave no response, but his breathing seemed to ease at the sound of familiar voices. That evening, as the sun began to dip beyond the horizon, a breeze drifted in through the open front door. It stirred the old curtains and rustled the leaves outside. Mrs. Ellis reached down and took Max's paw in both of her hands. She held it close to her chest. "Walter's waiting for you," she whispered. "You did everything he asked, and more." The room fell quiet. Max let out one last long breath, gentle, deep, and final. Then he was still. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Ellis did not cry right away. She sat quietly, rocking slowly, still holding Max's paw. There was peace in the room, beautiful, aching peace. "He's free," she said softly. "He's finally free." The news spread quickly. The neighborhood came alive with quiet mourning. A few neighbors stopped by, leaving candles, dog toys, flowers, and handwritten notes on the porch. Someone brought a small American flag and placed it near the plaque. Even the children who once feared the silent dog now knelt by the steps, whispering goodbyes to the hero they had grown to admire. That night, Mrs. Ellis and Daniel wrapped Max gently in the blanket he loved. Together, they placed him in a handcrafted wooden box lined with soft fabric. It was not just a burial. It was a ceremony. The next morning, beneath a tall oak tree in her backyard, Mrs. Ellis held a quiet service. A few close neighbors gathered. Daniel read a short speech about loyalty. A retired Marine, who had never spoken to Mrs. Ellis before, offered to play taps on his trumpet. And then, with hands that trembled slightly, Mrs. Ellis placed a small frame beside Max's final resting spot, the photo of him and Walter Harris, standing side by side in uniform. No one spoke for a while. There were no loud cries or dramatic words, just the soft sound of wind through leaves and the distant barking of a dog down the street. Max's watch had ended, but his story was far from over. That evening, Mrs. Ellis stood on the porch of the old Harris house one last time. She looked out over Oak Ridge Lane, where Max had stood guard for so long. The plaque beside the door caught the sunset light and gleamed gently. She smiled through her tears. "You kept your promise, Max." And now, it was her turn to carry his memory forward. Spring returned to Oak Ridge Lane with a quiet warmth. Trees bloomed again. Children filled the sidewalks with laughter, and birds sang from the rooftops. But something was missing, something that once made the street feel watched over, guarded. The porch across from Mrs. Ellis's home now sat empty. No figure stood watch. No quiet bark greeted passersby. But in place of absence, something new had taken root. Remembrance. People still came by the old Harris house. Not just neighbors, no, but strangers. Some had read about Max in the local paper. Others had seen the online tribute Daniel helped put together. The story of the German shepherd who waited became a symbol of loyalty across town. At first, the visits were quiet flowers left by the gate, children drawing paw prints in chalk on the sidewalk, military veterans stopping for a salute. But soon, something more began to grow. One afternoon, a city worker knocked on Mrs. Ellis's door. His name was Jonah, and he had tears in his eyes before he even spoke. "Ma'am, I was hoping we could do something official," he said. "For Max." Mrs. Ellis tilted her head. "Official?" He smiled. "We want to rename the small park at the end of the street. Make it something permanent, something people won't forget." A few weeks later, a small ceremony was held at what had once been called Oak Ridge Green. Now, a hand-carved wooden sin stood at its entrance, surrounded by a bed of marigolds and small American flags. Max's place in honor of loyalty, service, and love. Mrs. Ellis stood beside Daniel, her eyes filled with tears as the ribbon was cut. Dozens of neighbors clapped, many holding framed pictures of Max or tiny flags in his memory. The mayor gave a short speech. He wasn't known for emotional words, but even his voice cracked as he said, "We live in a time where people often forget what it means to be truly loyal. Max reminded us every day for 3 years that love doesn't leave and duty never fades." Daniel stepped forward and shared a story few had heard the night. Max crossed the threshold of the Harris home and chose to rest. The crowd listened, silently, some wiping their eyes, others smiling softly. At the center of the park, a bronze statue now stood, crafted from a photo Daniel had submitted. It showed Max in his iconic pose, sitting tall, ears alert, eyes forward, facing an invisible door only he could see. Below the statue, a plaque read, "He waited, he guarded, he loved. Max forever faithful." Mrs. Ellis visited the park often. She'd sit on the bench beneath the tree where the statue stood, often with her journal in hand. Sometimes she'd read the same stories aloud, just as she used to on the porch. Other times, she'd simply sit in silence and let the wind carry the memories. Children who played nearby began to learn Max's story. Some even left dog toys at the statue's feet, or tucked hand-drawn notes between the flowers. "You were a good boy. My dad says you were a hero. I want a dog like Max." One evening, Mrs. Ellis found a folded piece of paper wedged beneath the plaque. It was written in the careful handwriting of a child. "Dear Max, I didn't know you, but I think you were the bravest dog in the world. If I ever get scared, I'm going to remember how you waited. I hope you're with your person now. Love, Ellie." Mrs. Ellis pressed the note to her heart. Max had done what no one expected. He had waited for someone who would never return. But in doing so, he reminded an entire town that love could last beyond time, beyond pain, even beyond death. His story had not ended with silence. It had become something greater, a legacy. That night, Mrs. Ellis stood at her window, looking across the street at the house Max once guarded. It stood quiet and still, but the porch light flickered on, casting a soft glow. She whispered, "Good night, Max." And in the wind that gently brushed her curtains, it almost felt like he whispered back,